Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Up the Ladder podcast. This is Dr. Endel, and we've got Angela joining us again.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about PCOS, which is Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome.
That's correct.
And this is a topic that affects a lot more women than I realized. But we were able to help a recent patient start to have children. So we were able to help her have 2 so far, and she's working on a 3rd. And so she wrote us a really amazing testimony, which I'll read in just a second. But through working with her, we've learned a lot about it. So we've got some really great resources and things that maybe a lot of people wouldn't have realized can really positively impact people who are dealing with PCOS.
That's right.
Yeah.
So PCOS symptoms vary from women to women, and it's not always, hit the nail over the head classic. Some people don't even know that they have it until they're trying to get pregnant. Mm-hmm. But anything that ranges from, missing cycles to maybe just cycles being present a partial time of the year to that acne or to irregularity, and then awful PMS symptoms, and then yes, infertility is another really big one.
Yeah, and I feel like you hear a lot of young girls talk about how awful or irregular their cycles are.
Yes.
In adolescence, but I don't think that they really realize the extent of the issue until maybe a little bit later.
Right.
Like you said, when they're wanting to have children.
Right. If any type of dysmenorrhea, or what we call excessive cramping or really uncomfortable periods or just irregularity, the solution usually is to put that person on the pill. Mm-hmm. And in Western medicine, it does create a regular cycle. You can have a 28-day regular cycle, but that doesn't mean that cycle is going to be a normal cycle. And whatever was there pre-birth control pill, whatever hormonal disruption caused this, and there's an onslaught of really fun, thyroid compounded with insulin resistance, compounded with, maybe unhealthy genetic, ovarian signaling, things like that. But those things are still going to be present when they come off the pill to try to get pregnant.
Yeah. So what are the, classic, what's happening hormonally with someone who has PCOS?
So PCOS, when they say polycystic ovarian, what happens is there are several immature follicles on the ovary where really there's supposed to be just one mature. So you were supposed to have enough hormone balancing to produce a mature follicle that will later then be able to release an egg. What happens in polycystic ovarian syndrome is that you have a up to 12 different immature follicles that are not going to be able to release those eggs, and it does show up on an ultrasound as cysts. Mm-hmm. Sometimes.
Yeah. And so normally through a cycle, as you get to ovulation, you see estrogen start to rise, you see that as that comes down, you see LH and FSH spike. Right. Which is how they measure the ovulation period, right? Mm-hmm. So with people who have, with women who have PCOS, you typically see a higher androgen, so it'd be higher testosterone.
Yes. Which
then lowers the estrogen levels. Is that correct?
That is so correct. And people ask all the time. That seems to be that's the golden question. Why are my androgens so high? Mm-hmm. And as far as nutrition is concerned, is definitely insulin resistance, because insulin can actually trigger progesterone to convert into testosterone. So when we have too much insulin in the mix of things and we become really sensitive, and I have some fun ways to describe insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance if you'd like me to, but that could also be another subject. But I like to think of it as definitely that is a huge factor and a huge nutrition piece in PCOS.
Awesome. And so when we were working with this particular lady, one of the first things we did was we took saliva. So we did a saliva hormone panel.
That's great.
So a lot of people, and a lot of doctors will just do, a blood test, and that tells you what your hormones are at that specific picture.
Right.
But using a saliva test, in her case, she was having extremely long cycles. So, anywhere from 40 to 60 to 80 days
yes.
between cycle marks. And so we wanted to try to get an idea of what, over the course of that period of time, what was happening with hormones. And so every 2 to 3 days, we were collecting saliva samples. And then at the end of, I think we just measured it for like 42 or 45 days. We sent that in, and then we could get a snapshot of, here's where your estrogen's at, here's where your progesterone's at, here's where your DHEA is at.
Yes.
Where do you see an LH, FSH, like what are happening with all of that?
Right.
And so in her case, what we found was that progesterone was high and there was no estrogen peak or cycle, which we just said makes a ton of sense. And so do you have any experience with testing, or like what's the best way for women to try to understand their cycle in general, or more specifically like what's happening in PCOS?
Right, I agree. I think that you definitely need to look at the saliva test because there's so many more. Whether or not is this an LH signal? Am I getting an LH signal? Some people may not be getting an LH signal. So do we need to go to the ovary? Do we need to nourish the ovary? Is this about ovarian health, or is this strictly about managing hormone levels? And what can we do to manage those types of levels too?
Yeah. And so you kind of touched on briefly, like what are the symptoms of PCOS?
Okay.
So maybe break down that
sure.
a little bit more.
Well, because of the, like you said, excess androgens, one of the really obvious is hair growth, actually. And that hair growth can actually, it's the arms, facial hair growth. You can have it lower abdomen, and the hair growth is a little bit more coarse and heavy than you've experienced in different areas. So that's a huge one. Missing irregularity is a huge one.
Of the cycle.
So the cycle irregularity is huge, but acne is even less. Actually a lot of people with PCOS experience a lot of acne. So I would say those would be probably the top 3. And that's why it's so easily missed.
Because they're common.
It's just, they're so common.
Yeah. Or it's things, women may not want to,
right.
talk about, or
Sure.
it's not any, something that's affecting their everyday life.
That's well said. It's not necessarily considered an emergency. You're right, exactly. But definitely that hair growth, and me being Italian, I can talk about it. There's no shame in my game. So yeah.
Okay. And so conventional treatments usually like the pill, metformin, because we talked about how insulin resistance is related to this. So how does insulin resistance and PCOS tie in together?
Okay, for that simple reason of the ability to insulin surges triggering progesterone to turn into testosterone is really where it all falls out. And
so say that again.
Okay, insulin surges will trigger progesterone to turn into testosterone, and that's where it all falls out. So yeah. Okay. So primarily when we're talking about the direct correlation between the two, this is exactly where it is. So honestly, nutrition can really have such a huge impact in this space, and so can nutraceutical herbs and things like that. So the metformin, like you were talking about, berberine is an amazing insulin sensitivity. I don't even know what to...
Regulator.
Regulator, that's a really good word. And if we're talking about why does insulin resistance and what is insulin resistance? Insulin is I like to think of it as the mother hormone. She collects all of the nutrients and she funnels it into the liver or the muscle, or she takes all the carbohydrates, the nutrients, the proteins, and she shuttles those things and puts them away where they need to be.
Yep.
Right? But when, the kids come home and they start, messing up the house and bringing more things in, and, they make a mess and they don't do their laundry, she has to put all these things away. But eventually, when there's no place for them to go, and you didn't do a Goodwill rush, and you didn't, go through everybody's old clothing and put away what didn't fit anymore, it starts to, come out into the hallways and eventually spill over into and out of the house. That's my funny little analogy is for the mom hormone. So we become more and more desensitized because mom gets really overwhelmed and is like, forget it. Like I can't put this anywhere anymore. So we have an influx of it into the fat cells. Fat cells are going to be a really important conversation later. So remind me of that, because I want to talk about the fat cells of even animal organisms and how this actually relates to that. But as far as being able to modulate good blood sugar balancing to create enough sensitivity, such as exercise, because you don't even need insulin. When you exercise, your body shuttles glucose into the muscle without insulin.
Yep.
So exercise is an amazing tool to use if you have PCOS and you're trying to gain more sensitivity, as is berberine, as is berberine, a nutrient. Yeah.
And diet.
And diet is going to be huge. Oh, and let's talk about that too, because I know that it's really being able to tune in and for each of us individually to find out where our carbohydrate tolerance is, because in women who have PCOS, it varies. Our carbohydrate tolerance and insulin and blood sugar balancing is going to vary from person to person, and that can become very relative, as in, what is too much carbohydrate for me definitely is too little carbohydrate for you. And it's really being able to tune in and find out, how much of carbohydrate can I actually tolerate before I start gaining weight, I display acne, or I've got hormonal disruption. And that's really where the sweet spot is.
Interesting. So I guess a couple of things on just insulin resistance in general, right? So not everyone who has PCOS is going to have insulin resistance.
That's right.
Right. So in this case, Lauren did not have it because we tested her fasting insulin levels, and so if it's under, I want to say 6, that's a really healthy level. Over 8, you start to get into the pre-diabetic ranges, and then that's where insulin resistance and that metabolic system is really affected.
Yes.
Now, the only way to really know what your insulin levels are to have a fasting blood test. But you can also finger prick tests. Right? Usually, women who are doing this are measuring everything else.
I know.
Right? Temperatures, and they're doing ovulation tests at home.
Right.
And so, doing a finger prick test in the morning would be something else to add to that, but would be super effective if you're trying to figure out, is this an issue that I need to, could be playing into, the cascade of hormones being imbalanced, right?
Right.
So, what else? Gut health is super important.
Yes.
So we talked about insulin resistance. How would gut health play into hormones and some of the changes that we would, somebody would need to address as far as, increasing health status while trying to deal with this?
Sure, inflammatory markers, especially where gut health is concerned, is going to have a huge impact on any type of syndrome. And any type of syndrome. So you think about, am I eating well as far as for you as a biochemical individual, and making sure that gut health is optimal, just to bring down all the inflammation.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
So then, when we're looking at, before we get into specific nutraceuticals and how they are impacting, what kind of diet changes would someone ideally would we like to see make? So with Lauren, we went a lot more with a paleo or Mediterranean diet.
Yes.
Versus keto.
Yes, and I think that is so important, and let me emphasize why. So like I said, we all have different tolerance variables of where we need to go with our carbohydrates. But I find in women who have PCOS, a huge component is we really need to watch where we need the animal protein. To some degree, we really need to watch the animal fat, because if you think about all the pollutants in the air, and even if you're eating hormone free and you're antibiotic free and you're still eating a grass-fed type of animal protein, you still have to think about what that animal has to go through, and all that compounded toxic material is going to show up in the fat cells of that animal. So being able to eat lean proteins and lean cuts of meat, you're thinking the chicken breast and the lean cuts of the pork loin, and your versus bacon is everything.
Right.
Is going to be really important here, because you don't need the compounded hormonal consequence of that animal also.
Yep.
So.
And with paleo or the Mediterranean diet, you're getting more healthy carbs.
Yes.
And you still should be getting a healthy balance of the the proteins, fats, and carbs.
Yes.
But I feel like the healthy carbs, especially if you're trying to balance cycling, having some carbohydrates is actually, I think, super important.
Necessary.
Yeah, it's necessary.
Metabolically.
Yeah.
Yes.
And along with that, cutting out the vegetable oils.
Yes.
So that'll play a huge role in reducing the inflammation.
Yes.
As well as gut health, but also the disruption that you see with vegetable oils and
yes.
hormones and
even
insulin sensitivity.
And expound upon that, because when you see vegetable oils, you don't notice that's even canola oil. Can you expound upon that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it has to do with the amount of processing that has to happen with corn oil.
Yes.
And canola oil, and a lot of the oils that may normally be a moderately healthy food, but once you process that down to to become an oil, it becomes a huge disruptor in hormones. Your liver
yes.
absolutely cannot handle it.
No.
And so since all of your hormones are getting processed through your liver,
exactly.
It'll produce a sluggish liver, which hormones will start to get backed up.
That's right.
And that will affect the kind of that cycle
yes.
of how hormones are.
Yeah, the transformative process in which they need to, transform.
Yeah.
So
that's, I guess, kind of leads to another aspect of the diet and lifestyle recommendations would be, supporting liver and
100%.
Taking a lot of the burden off of that liver so the hormones can get processed correctly and through the liver. We also talked about, especially with Lauren, and this is something that we're starting to take a look at a lot more, which is timing, right, of eating, and not only daily but through the cycle. So of course this is individualized depending on each person, but normally we would recommend kind of an intermittent fasting, or changing the window of eating a little bit more for the insulin factors, right? So it's not so much don't skip breakfast as much as it might be don't go grab all the snacks in the evening.
That's right.
Right? And so even if you're doing a 12-hour window, you can still have breakfast and you can still have a great dinner.
Right.
It's that, late night snacks, the ice cream, the what you tend to grab in the refrigerator at 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. That has a lot more to do with liver, blood glucose, and insulin sensitivity. But then something else that we're starting to experiment with people who have this is, when to have more carbs and when not to have more carbs.
Yes.
And so, there's a reason that, women have PMS, leading up to their cycle is, they crave more food. There's a biological reason that is happening.
Yes.
And so starting to take a look at, in this case, how can we kind of help the body become more in sync with natural rhythms? And so along with what we're doing supplement-wise, we're saying carb load during these days of your cycle.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean go crazy with pizza. It means eat more of the healthy carbohydrates that you would normally be eating as part of these diets.
Right.
But that's been really interesting to see how women are, being affected by and how that affects fasting and
even psychologically. And we can talk about that too, because with those days where it's like, I can have the lentils, or I can do the brown rice pasta, or I can have a couple of extra sweet potatoes or things like that. It does put the body in a state of ease, which we didn't even talk about how stress plays into all of this as far as having hormonal consequences. Oh my gosh, exactly. And this really actually takes the load off on that side of it too. So
Awesome. So we talked about cleaning up the diet, looking at insulin factors. When we take a look at nutraceuticals or supplements that really drive a lot of these changes also.
Yes.
What are some of the big ones that we normally recommend, and why? Or what are those doing? Why should someone take a look at those?
Sure. So there are a lot of different ways to go about this. Just like you said, the berberine and the milk thistle, that combination is going to help with insulin sensitivity, but will also help your liver also.
Yep.
Which is beautiful. And now we talk about ovarian health. And so being able to come alongside and nurture the ovaries to develop those mature follicles is a huge component of that. So standard process carries something called Ovex, which is amazing as far as being able to nourish the ovary to come alongside of it, repair, replenish, things of that nature. My mind is drawing like I love Tribulus, so Tribulus everything. So Tribulus for everyone.
And Chase Tree.
And Chase Tree is an estrogen modulator, which is really important. So when you look at what the levels are doing, whether there's a surge there, whether there's not a surge, whether there's too much estrogen, because sometimes there can be. And I guess I didn't mention that as far as the hormone being present in fat the most, as far as eating animal fat, it's estrogen that's present in that mostly. But being able to modulate estrogen and actually helping that turnover, Tribulus will help that. It's a testosterone modulator, actually.
And I love how you reference it as a modulator, because anything that we're recommending is not specific hormones, right? We're not dosing hormones, and the fact that we want to add estrogen or add progesterone, or we're not advocating hormone replacement, although that's maybe necessary in some cases.
Right.
But a lot of what we're trying to do is your body is capable of running and functioning at a different level.
Yes.
And so if we can kind of give it a little boost to help modulate or regulate those levels,
yes.
I think that's a great So walk me through, again, kind of, so we look at chaste tree. What exactly, what are the benefits of chaste tree? So it's modulating estrogen.
It is modulating. It has a lot of benefits, actually, as far as being able to regulate cycles. It has that going for it. It is its name is, it's funny, Vitex is actually the name of it. But it really is great, actually, for skin health also. So,
nice. Some of the other ones, so chaste tree tribulus. The standard process also carries some things called hypothalamics and pituitropin.
Yes.
And so those are super important because that's a lot of where LH and FSH and a lot of those sex hormones are made and produced in those areas.
Yes.
And so again, if you can just help support those specific glands,
right,
or parts of the brain, then again, you're just focusing the body's energies at those areas so it can function better.
Yes, and that really does support the hypothalamus, adrenal, pituitary, thyroid axis. So like you said, all those glands along all those sides, and allow them the communication they need between each other to do what the body knows to do.
Yeah. And then I think another benefit of doing the hormone testing before you develop real protocol for someone is seeing where those hormones are at, but also at what point should you add supplements or take supplements away. So in a lot of cases, when someone should be ovulating, we will add tribulus, we'll add ovotropin PMG,
yes,
to support that actual ovulation period. And so what is I guess that kind of pulsing,
right?
What are we trying to affect?
It is. It's different for each woman's cycle too, but you're trying to come alongside during. It is all about timing. So within that 5 to 14 day cycle leading, into, there's definitely a different timing in place. Is that what you were referring to as far as how the cycle? And it's very different because where some women might have a 28-day cycle, awesome, other women are having a 38 to 40-day cycle.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think having a better idea of when that ovulation should be happening,
yes,
is crucial with somebody who has PCOS because
100%.
You're trying to the odds are stacked against you for how those follicles.
That's right. They are.
Mature,
yes,
how that process happens.
And knowing the timing of it is important because when you put that ovotropin PMG in place, what you're doing is you're providing a protective mechanism, or what I like to say decoy. That's what a protomorphogen is. They're really special and they're very different. Only standard process makes protomorphogens, but what they do is they provide this protective mechanism against anything going in and trying to manipulate the ovaries during that time, which is pretty special. So knowing when you're ovulating, again, keeping an eye on that, whether you're temperature gauging or whatever you're doing for that is super important.
Awesome. So what have we missed about PCOS?
Wow, this has been such a great conversation. Yeah. I just am really loving today. So
awesome.
Yeah, if you guys have any questions, and if there's anything you think we're missing.
Okay, so to recap, I think number one would be knowing that there's options.
Yes.
Right. Like in Lauren's case, she was seeking a highly rated fertility expert, and they were giving her very little hope about being able to get pregnant. And so just knowing that there are still, the ball is in your court, there's still some things that you can also do, even if you're seeking medical interventions. Like there's a lot of other things that you can do to support your own body system and this process.
Yes.
I think that would be my biggest take home, would be some hope that, for women who are trying to get pregnant, especially, that there's some other options out there.
Yes.
To aid in that. So Otherwise, something else that we'll have to look at some other time is like managing PCOS long term and tonics and some fun things like that, because there's a whole other conversation.
Yes.
It's not just about getting pregnant, although that's a driving factor for a lot of women.
Sure.
So that is it for today. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time on Up the Ladder.